Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. On January 20th, Donald Trump was sworn in as president for the second time, and it turned out he was serious about wanting to be a dictator on day one. His flurry of executive orders have already set off multiple constitutional crises, and my worries as a liberal about the future of liberalism and its institutions were, if anything, too minor. And all this is happening in a media environment that looks nothing like it did even a decade ago. It's fragmented into partisan and ideological bubbles, and legacy media has been muscled aside from its place at the center of the conversation, replaced with influencers, podcasters, YouTubers, and others outside elite circles. To discuss where we are, where we're headed, and how we can understand and respond to this new world, I'm joined by Anthony Fisher, senior editor at MSNBC Daily. If you enjoy Reimagining Liberty, I encourage you to check out my companion newsletter, where I write about the kinds of ideas we discuss on this show. You can find it on my website at www.aaronrosspowell.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Anthony. We're recording this 9 days after Trump was inaugurated into his second term as president, and it has been a busy 9 days, a distressing 9 days, at times a demoralizing 9 days, horrifying. Where are we right now?
Well, surely it can only go up from here, right? Like we're reaching levels previously unimaginable, even in the first administration. One argument I saw on one of the socials yesterday was that this itself is a self-coup attempt, that the hollowing out of just the basic functions of government and, career civil servants, which was all promised, but actually seeing it enacted so quickly with such a deluge that it's hard for anyone to keep up, hard for the people it's affecting to keep up, hard for the media to keep up, hard for the courts to keep up with, which again seems to be the idea. So where do we, I think your question was, where do we go next? It's all spinning so fast. You think it's got to slow down at some point. At some point there needs to be able to be some kind of reprieve where the opposition to this can take stock of what's happening. But, it's still going real fast right now, and we're still in the middle of confirmation hearings, so we still don't even know exactly who's going to be steering the ship. But looks increasingly likely that it'll be the people that the president wants.
Are you surprised at the response from people outside of the GOP? Like, I think neither one of us is terribly surprised at what's happened or how on board members of the GOP, including in Congress and including when their own authority is being usurped by the president, have been with this, because they've been telling us this is who they are for a while. But it does seem surprising to me, at least, and maybe I've just been terribly naive through this whole process, that say that the Democrats have been as quick to capitulate as they appear to have been, that they're supporting nominees for the various positions, that they seem to be taking let's not call this what it is, but instead just focus on nuts and bolts and work with the administration where it makes sense and not work with them where it doesn't. Most of the real anger, most of the real warnings about, say, the constitutional crisis with blocking the agencies from spending from money that was approved by Congress and so on. Most of that seems to be coming from some journalists, activists, people on social media, but say the mainstream press, like the New York Times and Washington Post, don't seem terribly perturbed by this stuff. And the Democrats in Congress, with a handful of exceptions, AOC being the most vocal, kind of seem to be wanting to treat this all as just another normal administration they disagree with on policy.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to lump everybody together. I think that particularly in the case of the New York Times and the Washington Post, a lot of times it's the headlines that water everything down, but the reporting is actually pretty solid. That there are things happening under the hood that I wouldn't be aware of if not for certain legacy media reporting. But I do agree that at every turn, I don't want to mess it up, but I think the New York Times had a headline about Caroline Leavitt's first press conference as press secretary that said she was steely or something like that. Like that's okay. That's a word for it. And in Congress, I think it's been said, but the organized massive resistance to President Trump that we saw in 2017 is just obliterated. That he won re-election after everything he did in 2020 and 2021, that he escaped prosecution. I think there's no unifying theme for Democrats in Congress to seize on. I think, like you said, AOC, remarkably the voice of reason here, saying this is all bad, but I don't think I think that the state of the Democratic Party after the dramatic collapse of the Biden administration and the Harris-Walz campaign's inability to win leaves them without they're rudderless, and again it's been said a million different ways over the last 2 or 3 months, but I think that they don't feel a message that this is truly horrible and a threat to the republic is going to work anymore. Maybe because they made that case already, and I think it was a fair case to make. So I guess optimistically, part of me wonders if the idea is, hey, they won, they're in charge of everything now, and they're going to steer the ship into an iceberg. Let's just let them. Let's not. There won't be any more impeachment efforts, even if it's warranted. So they might just be saying they're going to be really bad at this, and let's let voters see it, and then we'll be back in power soon enough.
I guess I can buy into that story to some extent, but it feels like you could be doing all of that while also, say, gumming up the works on the worst of the appointees, or by pointing out that, yes, the strategy of saying they were going to try to rule as autocrats, as authoritarians, as a legitimately fascist movement, didn't find a ton of purchase in anticipation. That when you were telling the voters that 6 months ago, they were like, maybe not, but prices were lower in 2019 than they are now, and I want to go back to 2019, which I still think is the story of this election, was just don't be the incumbent when there's inflation.
I agree.
And so maybe they're thinking, that story didn't work, it won't continue to work. But it feels like this has been so dramatic. Our mutual friend Andy Craig has talked a lot about the impeachable offenses that have been committed. There were at least 2 of them: the blocking of grants and spending, the firing of the inspector generals, are both clearly impeachable offenses. It feels like you could be pointing all of that out a lot more vocally, while letting them fly things into the side of the mountain, if that's what you think is the right way to handle it. But I just wonder how much they're looking at the fact that his approval ratings were a few points above water, as in the week or 2 leading up to his inauguration, and now they're underwater again, and just overbought into this Trump has a mandate narrative. And I wonder if there's an element of that, then maybe, and this is my optimistic story, is maybe as his approval ratings plummet, which they're likely to, it's even without this last week, his approval rating at the start of his term was probably the highest it was going to be at any point.
Sure.
in the 4 years. Maybe if they see him dramatically underwater, they'll realize he doesn't. He never had, but he certainly doesn't now have a mandate.
It's a good point. And yeah, I mean, it is remarkable that after everything that's happened, and after Trump having consistently underwater approval ratings since he officially entered politics, he did have that pre-inauguration bump, and I think it speaks to the mission of that movement, that rather than gliding in and taking it nice and slow and enjoying what is a pretty strong economy and pretty low unemployment and inflation relatively under control comparatively, instead of just riding that and then taking credit for it, in less than 2 weeks, they're taking a hammer to the institutions. And when I say institutions, I'm not talking about institutions that are often thrown in scare words like the deep state or the mainstream media. I'm talking about literally the federal workforce, and grants and certain states, practically half of their spending ability comes from the federal government, and a lot of these are red states, and I can't imagine that they're going to be happy about this. So, like you said, there could possibly be just waiting for that moment when he doesn't seem so invincible. I don't believe he is, but perhaps some people are thinking he is right now. They might be waiting for just the pain of what's happening to hit, perhaps deep red states, or places that voted to lower the price of eggs. Maybe they're just waiting for that moment, knowing it's going to come soon. I would never, I'm not, I'm no partisan, and I would not try to get in the heads of the Democratic leadership. But I agree with you that you can do two things at once. You can raise an alarm for things that are worth raising an alarm about, even if you feel that you failed at this before, or that some voters might think that it's a Chicken Little situation. There's still things you can do to put your hand up and say, I object. And, maybe sooner than later, that'll be the more mainstream course of action among Democratic leadership.
How does the media environment play into this? Because I spend most of my media consumption comes through the people I follow on Blue Sky, which is not representative of the nation's water cooler conversation. But there are lots of people who are still on Twitter. There are people who get their news from MSNBC and have that they tend to lean in one direction. There are people who get their news from Fox News or from Newsmax and lean more in another, or very far in another direction. And so if the let them fly this into a cliff strategy is to work, there has to be a sense of blame. Like if things get really bad. So egg prices are the highest that they have ever been, or like that they've been, they're much higher than they were under Biden. Trump has not brought down the price of eggs. And we should note this is not Trump's fault and it's not Biden's fault. It's that there's bird flu killing chickens. And, but we blame presidents for anything and give them credit for anything. But if that's going to work, people have to kind of have a sense of cause and effect. Like if their medical treatments are cut off, or they have a harder time getting them, or the price of food shoots up, or whatever it happens to be, they have to know this is the fault of these. I mean, we just discovered like basically high school age kids who are running OMB now, and that we have to know where to point the blame. But the media environment is incredibly fractured. And so I, hanging out in Blue Sky, have a very good sense of like the chaos of this, but I imagine that, extended family members who spend most of their time watching Fox News probably don't have as strong a sense of what's going on and the constitutional crises that are unfolding and so on. Um, so is that a problem? Like, do you have a sense of how much what's going on is filtering out of the bubbles that we run in?
Yeah, well, I mean, so personally, I essentially quit Twitter after October 7th, 2023, because that was I think the first, you know, global seismic tragic event that, captivated the whole world for quite some time. And I found and I had found this for a while since Elon Musk took over Twitter, which he had almost a year before that. But this was the first like major newsmaking event where I found it impossible to get any reliable news. And a huge part of that is that the blue checks are amplified even far more than they were back when it was just, famous people or people who worked for legacy media outlets or a handful of influencers. Now it was exclusively people who paid for the subscription or people Elon Musk favored and considered important. And there was without, you know, getting into misinformation, disinformation panic, there was a tremendous amount of misinformation and disinformation. And I found it just worthless to find out what was going on. And, not incidentally, the discourse on Israel, Palestine, and just about everything else was also just worthless. It was the most extreme, often dishonest voices on many particular sides. And as somebody I've worked now strictly in the opinion journalism realm since 2019. My job I still love reported opinion and participated in it a lot, but my job is to follow the discourse, to participate in the discourse, to see where the conversations are going, to see who's, shifting the conversation. Every once in a while, there's literally a conversation, or there used to be a conversation on Twitter between two interesting folks that changes the way we start talking about it. That's all gone. It's just a despicable cesspool on Twitter. So I haven't really, a handful of tweets aside, promoting stuff, and not for a while. I pretty much haven't participated in it in, I don't know, 16 months. Though I know a lot of journalists and, opinion makers and quote unquote thought leaders, hate that phrase, but, that they're still on it and still participating. And, certainly what we might have once called the, right-wing AM radio or Fox News audience, which has since evolved into a podcast-heavy audience. They're still very much active on Twitter. So, yeah, I don't see, and when I've popped in on Twitter over the last 10 days, I haven't seen an urgency about the things that are happening. I see, there's either just rah, they're deporting people and they got rid of DEI and they're hitting all my culture war bugaboos just like they promised. And then there's a great many who might have claimed libertarian, heterodox, or centrist bona fides who've been quiet about this kind of stuff at best. That they just glide past it. And so I participate in Blue Sky. I recognize it's a bubble as well. I've been roasted for very not hot takes, but things that might be critical of the left or the Democratic Party. I've written critically about Biden and Harris for MSNBC. Often doesn't go well. So I recognize it's a bubble, but I do find that there is more interesting discourse happening there. And I do hope that it evolves into a broader political discourse. But to put a bow on it, the cleaving of information bubbles is horrendous for being able to deal with what's happening right now.
Do you have a sense of how many people are actually in these bubbles? And what I mean by that is, so Blue Sky yesterday evening passed 30 million users. That's just total registered account. So the actual number of active users, like I think the number of people liking posts each day sits at around 2 to 2.5 million, which is probably a better estimate of like how many people are active on the network. So it's fairly small. Uh, Twitter, we don't know how big it is. It's definitely smaller than it was when Musk bought it. Uh, Cable news, MSNBC, Fox News, they have millions and millions of viewers, but it still is a small fraction of the overall electorate. Same with the New York Times and Washington Post. These are all, they have their audiences, but it's not representative. Do we have a sense of, I guess, like how all of the people who will matter, their votes will particularly matter come 2026 and the congressional elections, or 2028 when there's a new presidential election? Like how much they're in the discourse, how much they're paying attention, how they're learning about this stuff?
I don't think there's hard data on that right now, but I mean, there's two things. One, the idea that Trump has an overwhelming popular vote mandate, we know is not true. That both Al Gore and Hillary Clinton had higher, popular vote percentages, and that the difference in the popular vote was the most narrow since 1960, with Kennedy narrowly beat Nixon. But we saw that the electoral landslide, where he won all the swing states and picked up in once solidly Democratic demographics, picked up in pretty much all of them, and also losing a lot in the ring suburbs that surround deep blue cities, even New York. There's just so many different demographics and so many different places in the country where it swung towards Trump in 2024 that I don't know that you could steer them towards any one media outlet or social media platform to be like, this is what you need to know. Like everybody, trust in media is I think at all-time lows, if not pretty close. And it's not all, some of it is, again, alternate media, people finding that they trust podcasters who, may or may not fact check more than legacy media outlets. And part of that can be, like and again, I hate lumping everything into one thing, but like mainstream media's, when they've failed, when they've gotten a story wrong or haven't corrected it quickly enough, or having, adjusted a narrative enough or made it loud enough that they, messed something up. There's also a bad faith attack on legacy media and mainstream media and institutions. And I believe this was I think Kathy Young wrote about this, that elites are held to an impossible standard. Again, elites, like any flaw, any story that was gotten wrong, it means that, their credibility is shot forever. But the anti-establishment voices, they don't have any standards whatsoever. If they got something wrong, like there's a Joe Rogan clip that's very famous, or notorious, where he just says something that's flat out untrue. His fact checker or producer corrects him on it. And then he and his guests go, well, just that I thought it could be true really says something, and how do you fight that? It's literally vibes. It's the opposite of facts don't care about your feelings. So, and that is so widespread, that, if there's a way to put a Band-Aid on it, if there's a way to stop the bleeding and get people back into an accepted group of facts, or at least sources that we can say for the most part they get it right, always be skeptical of everything, but for the most part we can say that they've verified this. I just don't know. I don't know if I don't even know if people want that again. I think there's a feeling out there right now where, I like my bubble. I trust my bubble. My bubble is they don't miss.
Yeah, I like the point about holding elites to a different standard, but I wonder how much that is just what we're seeing as kind of in-group, out-group thinking. Is because one of the features of the Washington or elite kind of media punditry is we all know people who have gotten basically everything wrong they've ever said on cable news, and yet they keep getting, no one ever calls them on it, and the host never says like, well, you've just made this prediction, but here's the last six predictions you made and they all turned out wrong. It's like once you're kind of in the circle, or Pamela Paul was recently fired from the New York Times, and thank God, because she was their worst columnist, and that says a lot.
Do we know that she was fired?
The reporting I saw made it sound like she was let go, and that a lot of it had to do with personal. She wasn't liked in the building was the reporting I saw, but but she's no longer there. But usually columnists at these things are just like kind of sinecures for a lot of people. And so there's very much this like, it feels like elites hold elites to the standards that non-elites are holding non-elites. And this is, so you hold your out group to higher standards than you hold your in group. And that just seems like, I don't know, I think this is, so, I think there's the main storylines to keep an eye on coming out of this election, besides the one of like, can the Republic survive, which is the most acute one right now. But the like longer term seem to be, well, first it's the inflation thing. Second, it's the movement of particularly young men to the right and like what's going on with men. But third, it is that the media environment changed over the last 10 or 20 years in ways that I think particularly people like inside the Beltway, elites didn't really have their finger on. I remember having conversations with my dearly departed friend and mentor, David Bowes, over years at Cato Institute, where I was saying to him, like, look, a lot of the conversation is happening on these social media places. That's where people are talking about politics, and that's where they're forming opinions. And it's happening in podcasts, and it's happening on YouTube. But he was like an old, like legacy media guy. And so his view was the most significant thing you could ever do to get your message out was have it published in the Washington Post. He was like a diehard Washington Post DC guy. But the audience's numbers for those were, the quantity of the percentage of the population reading the Post has been in decline. It's just not, it's not the outlet where people are forming their opinions. And as you said, it's podcasts and it's other things. And that shift. But I guess, so you work in this space. This does seem to be the story of how we dig ourselves, if we're to dig ourselves out, is first like adjusting, having the right messages in the places where people are actually listening and forming opinions. But that's become really dominated by the right.
Mm-hmm.
Like right-wing podcasts do very well. This was always the people, Facebook is censoring conservative voices when the top posts every month on Facebook are always from these like fairly shrill far-right conservatives.
The Daily Wire was like the number one for years. It was,
yes.
And the Daily Wire sort of cultivated and created its audience on Facebook. Like that, it was they just pumped out so much aggregated stuff on Facebook. That's really that was the early seeds of their audience.
So, is there a way for, I guess we'll call them broadly liberals, people who oppose the sort of thing that we are seeing right now, to better get the message out or critique the other side in those kinds of spaces? Or do you have a sense of like why it is that those spaces have become so dominated by not just the Joe Rogans and not just the Ben Shapiros, but also these guys who are nominally like not even political podcasters. They're talking about sports. They're talking about video games. They're talking about like health and fitness, but it's everything they're talking about is like run through with kind of right wing cultural values, culture war talking points, general vibes.
I mean, I think Bloomberg just did a really interesting investigation on 18 of the biggest podcasts that are, as you described, sort of right-coded, bro-ish, but none of them explicitly political. There's a few things. I if even in Joe Rogan's like I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter days, there was always that kind of, I'm into guns, I'm into the alpha male stuff, I'm going to talk about weird stuff like low T. There was always these uh, little nuggets that have since become part of the firmament of the right of center broadcast environment. And I remember in the 2020 campaign during the primary, I actually covered Andrew Yang a lot for Business Insider. I was kind of early on I think there's going to be something here. Not saying anything about the merits of his campaign or him as a candidate, but just that I saw this internet excitement bubbling up that did seem to be it was organic. I mean, it wasn't like astroturfed, and a big part of it was just his ability to and willingness to talk to everybody. We saw Pete Buttigieg do that kind of thing, not quite as much as Andrew Yang, and not quite as he was a little more skittish about going on the broadcasts. But this, Andrew Yang, who I believe New York Magazine had a headline: "Random man runs for president." Got on the debate stage and like had he made a dent. He wasn't gonna. It was never gonna come close, but he made a dent. Pete Buttigieg, won or at least co-won the Iowa caucuses and got a cabinet position. He was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. This is I've been following presidential primaries for a long time. Neither of these biographies had ever made it as deep into the match, and I think that for whatever reason, this was not a lesson learned by the rest of the Democratic leadership or contenders. Everything remained very siloed off, very deliberate. Even in friendly environments, Kamala Harris was criticized for very short interviews and evasive answers that didn't win anybody over. And in a podcast, like one of these 3-hour long podcasts, when you get comfortable and loose, you may regret saying things or just say something not precise enough so that it can be clipped and held against you. I get that fear, especially in a bad faith media environment. But at the same time, when you let your guard down a little bit, there's a chance that you could become more appealing to the average viewer or listener. May not always be the most high information voter, but you've connected with them, emotionally somehow. Like, and it could be, it doesn't even have to be anything about policy. It could simply be like, I like this band or some biographical detail that reaches people. That being willing and unafraid to go those places is something that Democrats or liberals need to do if they want to claw their way back to 50%. And again, the whole idea that like we need a George Soros to fund a new Joe Rogan or a Joe Rogan of the left, misses the forest for the trees. Joe Rogan was not funded by any right-wing billionaire. Like he developed his audience organically, and the friends he made along the way might include right-wing billionaires. But it's you're not going to be able to just impose an audience on people. So if the left isn't creating the wellness podcast or the sports podcast that also has a leftist bent to it, or left of center bent, or even centrist bent, then you need to be willing to go into those spaces. I don't mean talk to everybody or you can absolutely still have no-go places or hosts that you just don't want to do business with, but the general idea that you can just keep it to 15, 20 minute, tightly orchestrated interviews, and that you're going to reach the people on an emotional level the way they're being reached on these podcasts or Substacks or whatever. I think we've seen it's not going to work. You need to change course.
I like that. There's a number of things I could want to highlight in that point for listeners. First, yeah, it is remarkable. This is another kind of elite, non-elite's difference is, a lot of people who come up in Washington circles have received or have kind of just picked up via osmosis what we might call like standard DC media training, and they often make for some of the most challenging guests I ever had in my decade plus of podcasting was the ones who had the most media training, because you'd say, okay, we're going to chat for an hour. It's an informal conversation. Ask the first question and they give you a on the dot 30-second answer and stop. And they okay, like, can you keep going? Like, just meander a bit, please. And that's because they have been brought up in either you are writing 700 words to run as an op-ed, which is not very many words, or you are doing a 2 or 3 minute cable news hit where you're going to have maybe a minute where you're actually talking. And so you have to be very polished, and you have to speak in these clips that can be pulled out, and like that's the one point you're going to make, and it's often the point you're going to make no matter what the question was. You're going to pivot it to that point. But it does not work at all and I think related to it is people want, you said talk about like the bands that you're into, and we talk about like who's the politician you'd want to go get a beer with, and I think that's also the story of Trump's success is, I find him like utterly loathsome and I can't stand listening to him, but a lot of people find him charismatic and they say he's funny. And I also think that's a kind of a condemnation of a lot of people's sense of humor, but he has a charm for a lot of people. And he does his rally speeches sound like a 3-hour Joe Rogan podcast. Like they just are all over the place and they're not polished at all. He's not hitting talking points and so on. And it does feel like that's just what people want now is they want someone who is charismatic, who feels like this person gets me or at least doesn't seem alien to me. They seem like someone who could be my peer. And they talk like me, which is not in a polished way. It's not in 30-second sound bites. It's not pre-practiced talking points or like focus grouped messages. But it does feel like a lot of people just kind of can't get out of the media training culture.
Yeah, and Trump has an unfair advantage on most politicians in that, we know he's incoherent. We know that he will say things that, he'll later, after generating outrage, say, well, you don't have a sense of humor. You don't get the joke, which, there's a word for that. But also, if he meanders and, says things that might get someone else in trouble or, might create a soundbite that another politician might have to answer for, he's completely immune from all of that and has been for a real long time. So when he, after everything that's happened, after, the attempted self-coup, January 6th, the classified documents, all the indictments, he can go on Joe Rogan for 3 hours and just giggle and, say wild stuff and two guys playing to each other's egos. And even, when Rogan or another comedian might make a joke at Trump's expense, Trump will laugh about it there. Like we know Trump has a very thin skin and some say, I don't necessarily believe this. Some say that Barack Obama's roasting of him at the White House Correspondents' Dinner was what inspired him to run for president. So we've seen that, like, he doesn't take a joke very well, but in a situation where it's backslapping, where it's like bros goofing on each other, which, is a way that a lot of men relate to each other. It's pretty natural. In that context, he's seen as relatable, even if he's a germphobe who has a decades-long reputation of stiffing the working man that he employs. None of this stuff sticks to him. All they see is a guy who's loose with their pal, the podcast host, and they know that the Democrat could not be that loose. It's not coincidental that the Democrats that a lot of these broadcasters love are questionable Democrats. They loved Tulsi Gabbard, they love RFK Jr. And those people as well are held to a lower standard than most other political figures. They can say things that are just flat out false. They can defend the indefensible and then just wash it away because their audience is not quote unquote liberals or Democrats. Their audience is this right-coded audience, this MAGA-friendly audience. And one more time, it's an unfair advantage. They can be looser and they can be more to the extent they have charisma, they can show that charisma. And somebody's got to be the first one to run through the wall on the Democratic or liberal side. Somebody's got to be willing to just hang in there, and I don't think that there's much to be afraid of, particularly like somebody like Joe Rogan. Like Joe Rogan, again, I don't want to go too deeply into his psyche or my judgments on him as a intellectual, but he seems like the kind of host that when you get in the room, he'll just, he's happy to have you in the room, So, I wouldn't have, there was that whole big thing. Should have Kamala Harris have gone on Rogan days before the election or not? I think she should have. I don't think it would have mattered, but I still think she should have. It would have been good practice for her and maybe a good model for other Democrats to see that, there are some hosts that would completely, that the whole purpose would be to just hammer you with what, maybe good faith, maybe bad faith questions. But in Joe Rogan's case, he'd probably try to get you to smoke weed. He'd probably try to get you to, I don't know, talk about guns, which, Kamala Harris was really trying to sell her, I'm a cop who owns guns thing. So yeah, somebody's just got to be the one willing to play in those spaces. And, you don't have to be a pushover. You don't have to agree with everything they're saying. In fact, I would say quite the opposite, but you got to play in those spaces.
Then so one concern I have about this, and maybe this is a way to close out our conversation today, is so there are kind of two messages that I think need to be out there now, or that in an ideal world, more people would take to heart. The first is the negative message of, hey, what's happening right now is really, really bad, and you should be concerned about it. That the ongoing attempt to establish an autocracy is really bad, even if you're not a, bleeding heart progressive, you should be concerned about the Constitution and separation of powers and so on. So there's that one. But then there's the more positive message that's, I think, the longer term needed one of, principled liberalism matters and is good. And so the alternative to what's happening here is principled liberalism and the society that can flourish when the government conforms to principles of liberalism. And when the society, takes to heart liberal values. But what I wonder about is, yes, people who have those views, liberals, can go into these spaces and they can talk. But to spin up essentially, these kinds of media, to get the principle of liberalism further across, you mentioned the kind of left-wing space, like the dirtbag left, as they're They're called Chapo Trap House and those kinds of things. A lot of those end up very like horseshoe theory exemplars.
Sure.
That
Absolutely.
they end up supporting Trumpism, I think often for what amount to aesthetic reasons or something that looks like aesthetic reasons. Like they just like and that's my concern, is that it's not necessarily that like the specific policies of the political right are what appeal to audiences that listen to bro podcasts or these kind of less polished, more caustic conversations, but that the values that cause you to enjoy that sort of stuff, to be drawn to those sort of people, when operationalized in the political arena, pull you to the right. Even if you say you're on the left, even if you're like, they pull you to kind of a toxically masculine, authoritarian sort of like, there's, I mean, there's a reason I think the alt-right, the contemporary alt-right basically began in Gamergate. It was about video gamers mad about girls.
Yep.
And so that's what I wonder about, is liberals can go on these podcasts, but I just wonder how much what we've seen is the media ecosystem has recognized that there's a substantial audience for people who just don't have liberal values, whatever political persuasion they call themselves. And so even if you spin up more liberal podcasts, are they going to have as much traction as, I mean, I remember Air America Radio in the 90s, which was the Democrats, the progressive left's attempt to kind of create their own Rush Limbaugh and their alternative to right wing. And it just flopped because it turned out it wasn't that those messages weren't out there. It was that the kind of people who listen to AM radio weren't interested in those messages.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the thing about podcasts is, they're a lot of people listen to podcasts, even if they're not listening to political podcasts. So it's not, whereas not everybody was like, I'm going to listen to AM radio, especially at night. You had to really like make an effort for that. On everybody's phone, there's 5 billion podcasts available at any given moment. And yes, the horseshoe theory is real. We saw quite a few of the Bernie Trump nexus. But I think the greatest advantage, and again, it's not foolproof, the greatest advantage to, liberals playing in these spaces is to demystify the idea that they are, lizard people, elites, that they don't know us, they don't understand us, they are made of different cloth, they are the enemy class. I just feel like a little bit of human exposure kind of demystifies that whole horrific conspiracy theory, which is increasingly mainstream. People saying phrases like the enemy class, might have been more broadly chilling 10 years ago, and now it's something the president says. So, if you take like who are the future contenders? Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, Pete Buttigieg. Only Pete Buttigieg among them has like been willing to like have these long conversations, and generally he doesn't come off like it's not even like a tremendous amount of personality is being shown. But Pete Buttigieg goes on Fox News regularly and always has, and there is something to be said for like when you do that enough, like they aren't always immediately reflexively treating you as a lizard person. That there's a certain amount of credit offered, and I just think there just needs to be more of that. And again, it doesn't mean acquiescing to bad faith conversations or laughing off horrible things, but it does mean like you can't pretend that they didn't win. You can't pretend that this isn't reality now. I remember in the first administration, when I was an editor at a different publication, getting some fierce internal pushback about an interview that a reporter did with Candace Owens. And I thought it was a very good interview. I thought the interviewer asked challenging questions, and we left it all out there. But in those days, that was seen as platforming, like to even have a conversation. And I made the case then, and I think it's just plainly evident now that you can't wish these people away. They've got influence. The best you can do is sunlight, and in my opinion, the most effective way to provide that sunlight is to just engage them directly. Like, don't try to make everything opinion based. Don't try to make everything a gotcha. Just literally let them talk. Let them talk. And I think the inverse of that is that so much of this right-leaning media ecosphere sees mainstream Democrats or mainstream liberals or mainstream liberal pundits or even, classical liberal pundits who are in opposition to the MAGA movement. They just see them as these inhuman elites. And if podcasts are good for anything, these long-form podcasts, it's humanizing the guest.
Thank you for listening to Reimagining Liberty. If you enjoyed today's episode, please send it to a friend, or take a moment to review the show on Apple Podcasts. And check out my free newsletter at www.aaronrosspowell.com.